Good morning, everybody. I'd just like to welcome you this morning to our study of Ezekiel. We're in chapter 31. Immediately following this video, I'm going to start another video for chapter 32, as I did last week when I did chapter 29 and then chapter 30 in two different videos. This week we'll do chapter 31 and 32 in two videos. These will conclude the judgment part of Ezekiel, and then we'll get into something very much exciting, and we'll talk about that at the end of the chapter 32. So here we are in chapter 31. The paragraph heading in the NIV is Pharaoh as a felled cedar of Lebanon. It's actually about the fall of Egypt and the fall of Assyria. All right, let's read verses 1 through 4. In the 11th year, in the 3rd month, on the 1st day, the word of the Lord came to me. Son of man, say to Pharaoh, now listen to this, say to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and to his hordes, consider Assyria. He says to Pharaoh to consider Assyria. Consider Assyria, once a cedar in Lebanon, with beautiful branches overshadowing the forest. It's towered on high, its top above the thick foliage. In verse 4, the waters nourished it, deep springs made it grow tall. Their streams flowed all around its base and sent their channels to the trees of the field. All right, verses 1 through 4. That date there, 11th year and the 3rd month and the 1st day, is actually June 21st, 587 BC. It's actually, I want you to notice here that God says you shouldn't be surprised at what will happen to you because it has already happened to Assyria, and for the same reason. So Pharaoh is getting a little warning here. It's about the rulers are depicted as trees. It looks like Egypt is compared to Assyria in the form of a tree of the cedar of Lebanon. All right, there's not a lot to say there, but I want you to notice that God says to Pharaoh, I'm going to tell you about Assyria. And then he goes on and starts talking about a tree there with all its characteristics through verse 4. Then in verse 5, I do want to make one thing out here, and it's in verse 2 when he says to Pharaoh, who can be compared with you in majesty? Who can be compared to you in majesty? He says that to Pharaoh. Then he says Assyria can. He says that in verse 3. I want you to remember that because we're going to come back to this at the end of the chapter. All right, verse 5 says this. So it towered higher than all the trees of the field. Its boughs increased and its branches grew strong, spreading because of abundant waters. Okay, the tallest tree of verse 5 is the symbolic reference to Assyria. Its former position as a major world power. Okay, verse 6 and 7. All the birds of the sky nested in its boughs. All the animals of the wild gave birth under its branches. All the great nations lived in its shade. Then verse 7. It was majestic in beauty with its spreading boughs, for its roots went down to abundant waters. Okay, the birds and the beast are symbolic of the smaller nations who became dependent on Assyria. Syria was a world power. They were not the first major world power who conquered the known world was Babylon. Assyria was actually before Babylon, but we know very well that they were a very strong power in the world. They were the ones that conquered the northern kingdom and all those around it. Okay, so that's what we're talking about here. Uh, the birds and the beast are symbolic of the smaller nations who became dependent on Assyria. Now, verse 8. The cedars in the garden of God, the garden of God, what does that sound like? Sound like Eden. The cedars in the garden of God could not rival it, nor could the junipers equal its boughs, nor could the plane trees compare with its branches. No tree in the garden of God could match its beauty. All right. No tree of any kind in the Garden of Eden could compare. Now, we're not really talking about Garden of Eden. We're all talking symbolically here. We're just pointing out that Assyria, as described as a tree, a metaphor as a tree, was stronger, more beautiful, more majestic, bigger, more well-watered, grew better than any other tree, is what we're talking about, than any other country. Then verse 9 says, I made it beautiful with abundant branches, the envy of all the trees of Eden in the garden of God. I made it beautiful. God made it beautiful. The reference is to Eden, but it is representative of the whole world. All right. We're talking a lot of symbolism in this chapter. The garden of God is a reference to Eden, but it is representative of the whole world. God put Assyria on top of the food chain, so to speak. It was beautiful, it had abundant resources, and it was the envy of all the nations. This is what God compared Egypt to. Remember back in verse 3, he said, Pharaoh, let me read it to you again, just so we get it straight. He said, Pharaoh, say to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and to the hordes, who can be compared to you in majesty? He said, Assyria. This is what God compared Egypt to. Then, in verse 10 and 11, God says, the same thing will happen to you, Egypt, that happened to Assyria. I give you Babylon. I give you to Babylon. I may have read this ahead of my, no, I think that's right. I give you to Babylon. Talked about the last, we talked about that last week where Babylon spent so much time trying to conquer Tyre. They conquered the land part, but they couldn't conquer the sea island part, and so they never got the wealth of Tyre after all their efforts. So God said, because you didn't get anything out of Tyre, I'm going to give you Egypt. Well, he's reiterating that now. So let's look at verse 10 and 11. Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says, because the great cedar towered over the thick foliage, and because it was proud of its height, I gave it into the hands of the ruler of the nations. That was the same thing we talked about last week. Babylon is the ruler of the nations. For him to deal with according to its wickedness, I cast it aside. Okay, it's because of their arrogance and pride that Egypt is being judged. Same way with Assyria, they were judged for the same reason. I think that note I just read was the part that should have gone with these verses. This is what he compared Egypt to. And for the same reason, Egypt's going to fall for the same reason that Assyria fell. He's going to be given to Babylon just like Assyria was. And we talked about that last week. So pride and perversion of power is the reason they were handed over in judgment. The nation Egypt, like Assyria, was handed over in judgment by Nebuchadnezzar, the ruler of the nations, the most powerful nation, and they were conquered. So they were handed over, but they were handed over in war they were handed to Nebuchadnezzar, and he conquered them with his power. But it was, remember, all of this is all about God directing them, sending them to do these things and giving them the power to get it done. It's all about God wanting these things done, and that's why it's being done. All right, so verse 12 and 13. I cast it aside, and the most ruthless of foreign nations, cut it down and left it. The most ruthless of nations, we talked about that last week, they call that Babylon. It's the same thing here. The most ruthless of nations is Babylon, and he cut that tree down and left it there laying in the dirt. He's going to cut down Egypt. He's going to kill Egypt. We talked about that last year. We had last week we had the 40 years of captivity. They were taken out of Egypt. Egypt was left desolate. They were taken out of Egypt for 40 years, and they were allowed to return after the 40 years. But for 40 years, there was nobody there. They were left. Its boughs fell on the mountains, and in the valleys its branches lay broken in all the ravines of the land. All the nations of the earth came out from under its shade and left it. So they lost their protector. Egypt was one of the protectors. And Assyria is one of the protectors. Each one of those were defeated, so the smaller nations around them were left unprotected. Nebuchadnezzar cuts down and leaves Assyria lying in a ravine for birds to seek shelter in a cut down tree. All right, verse 14 and 15. Therefore, no other trees by the water are ever to tower proudly on high, lifting their tops above the thick foliage. No other trees so well watered ever to reach such a height. They are all destined for death, for the earth below, among mortals who go down into the realm of the dead. No other tree. In other words, no other nation could reach the height of the tree representing Assyria. I suppose because Babylon is going to limit them. They're not going to allow something like that to happen. Because of the fall of Assyria, the protection of the smaller nations fall away as well. So with Assyria defeated, then Babylon defeats Assyria, then they're just able to go wherever they want to go, defeating whoever's next. That's what we're talking about here. Because of the fall of Assyria, the protector of smaller nations, the smaller nations will fall away too. Okay, we're still talking to Pharaoh from verse 2. We're still talking to Pharaoh about Assyria. And he's being told you're never going to rise to the level of Assyria. So let's look at verse 16 and 17. I made the nations tremble at the sound of its fall when I brought it down to the realm of the dead, to be those who go down to the pit. Then all the trees of Eden, the choicest and best of Lebanon, the well-watered trees, were consoled in the earth below. In verse 17, they too, like the great cedar, had gone down to the realm of the dead, to those killed by the sword. The sword is Babylon, by the way, remember? Along with the armed men who lived in the shade among the nations. So everybody was defeated by Babylon, and they all end up going down to the pit. And so when Assyria gets there and when Egypt gets there, they're going to be consoled by all those that were conquered before. That's what it says. It says up there right before the end of verse 17, then all the trees of Eden, the choicest and best of Lebanon, the well-watered trees, were consoled in the earth below. people that were already there, they were already killed, they were already in the pit, met them as they came down and consoled them. Sorry, guys, it's just the way it is. Okay, then we get to verse 18. Well, let's see. When Assyria went down to the pit in death and destruction, the sound of her fall caused other nations to tremble and mourn. Why? Because if it can happen to Assyria, it can happen to us. So that's what that was all about. I made the nations tremble at the sound of its fall. Those that were not conquered yet heard Assyria fall, and they say if it can happen to them, it can happen to us. When it did happen, they were met by those that had already experienced death and were in the pit, and so they console them when they come down. All right, so that brings us to verse 18. Which of the trees of Eden can be compared with you in splendor and majesty? That goes all the way back to that verse 2. I told you to not forget that. Verse 2 said, say to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and to his hordes, who can be compared with you in Eden, in majesty? And then he says Assyria. But then we get to verse 18, and he asks it again. So which of the trees of Eden can be compared with you in splendor and majesty? Yet you too will be brought down with trees of Eden to the earth below. You will lie among the uncircumcised with those killed by the sword. This is Pharaoh and all his hordes, declares the Lord. So verse 18 turns this, what he was saying about Assyria, into a comparison of Assyria to Egypt. He said it's going to happen to you as well. So the answer to the question God asked of Pharaoh in verse 2 is here. We started out talking to Egypt about the fall of Assyria. Remember, that's what he said. Who could be compared to you, Pharaoh? Well, maybe Assyria. So we started out talking about Egypt about the fall of Assyria. If it can happen to Assyria, it can happen to everybody else as well. Now we find out Egypt is a splendorous tall tree in Eden, and Egypt will fall. And Egypt will face judgment by the sword, which is Babylon, just as Assyria did. So I just want us to make sure we get that. Assyria fell because of their arrogance and pride. We talked about Egypt being full of arrogance and pride. They fell for the same reason. And God used the same nation to be his sword, and that sword is Babylon. So yes, Assyria rose to be top dog in the food chain, the most splendorous tree. Egypt thought, well, maybe we'll get there. God says, you're not going to get there. And the same fate, the same thing is going to happen to you that happened to Assyria for the same reason and by the same sword. All right, that's all I have for you today in chapter 31. I want you to be aware that, again, that I'm going to do another video right now. This one will terminate. I'll start a new one for chapter 32. All right, thank you for studying with me.